All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. If we've never met before, my name is Jillian Hawkins. I am the Assistant Executive Director here at the Illinois Democratic County Chairs Association. Thank you so much for joining us here. We've got a really great virtual training series session for you guys tonight. Before we get started, if you've never been on one of these trainings with us before, everyone's going to stay muted during the training. That just makes it easier for us since we'll have so many people joining. But if you have any questions, the chat box is open, and please put any questions you have as we go along in there, and we will get those answered for you. All right, so without further ado, I will introduce our guest trainers for tonight. We are joined by Becky Carroll, who is the CEO and president of C Strategies, and Chase Rowwinkle, who in his day job is the director of banking for the state of Illinois. They bring a lot of expertise about the economy and about communications. So really good session here tonight. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Chase.
Everybody, thank you, Jillian. I'm gonna share my screen here because it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without somebody having to do that. All right, and just before we get started, I'm honored to be on this discussion today, and I know this is, it's been known as the dismal science, economics before, but I really appreciate you having some interest today because they're just really one of the big items we got to talk about. Up top, as Jillian let you know, I am the director of banking here for the state of Illinois. Just want to say that my presentation today is my own opinions, not those of the governor's administration or my office, the Division of Banking under IDFPR. So we'll go through this just to give you a little bit of background about where I come from. So before I am the director of banking for the state of Illinois, was appointed in 2019 to that, and I regulate the banks here, as well as a number of other items. Before that, I was the chief economist for the comptroller's office, served under Susana Mendoza there. And then before that, I was the policy director for the state treasurer. So I've been on a couple of different items here in government and politics, mostly on the finance side. That is where my graduate degree is in and my specialty. So without further ado, let's talk about the economy. So first, just want to do the famous statement, it's the economy, stupid. So most people that I talk to struggle with discussing finances or economics because of the language, I think, and some of the details that make people feel like they don't get it or they feel stupid. And that really is something that I'd like to demystify here. And I hope that we can at least get you some of the way there. And if there's further questions about that, we can direct you kind of to how to go about those items. Economics has a language like any other subject does, and it's in some ways purposefully obtuse, so that you have to hire experts to kind of go through the different pieces to it. And I know Becky will kind of get into how to talk about those things, but it is important. You know, according to Gallup, 40% of Americans list the economy as the most important issue facing the country. The next closest is 18%, which is leadership. You know, there's been a lot of studies on how economics impacts elections. I know a lot of people say, well, you know, when the economy is bad, the ruling party does poorly. And for a lot of the cases, that's true, which is why it's even more important for us as Democrats to be able to talk about this subject and where we're actually succeeding and where maybe we can discuss where we can go next. But there was a famous study from Vanderbilt that showed that for every extra percentage point in GDP growth was associated with a rise of 1% in the incumbent's party voter share. So that's the tides you're looking at, and we'll go into GDP in a second. So you will be asked about the economy early and often, especially when you're talking on the doors with different constituents. You need to know kind of the general state of things if you're going to be able to provide a strong case. So let's talk about how things look. And in general, they're in a difficult position, but an unusual one, and we'll get into why that is. So the GDP, which we'll discuss in a second, it's basically our output for as a nation. It's decreased at an annual rate of 1.6% in the first quarter of 2022. So it is down for the year, and it is projected as an annual down for the rest of the year, which means our output is lower than we would expect. Stock market, people are usually aware of that, especially if you're looking at your 401k or your retirement. You can see that some of the indices and major exchanges are down. Dow Jones down 14% year to date, S&P right around 20%, NASDAQ almost 30%. Treasury yield curve, which is usually the thing that most people struggle with the most when I have this conversation. We'll discuss that. Also, an important recession indicator is negative, and I'll tell you that that is not where we want it. It's a 10 to 2 year Treasury yield curve is at 20%, negative 2 basis points after the previous market day, and is 1.808 from last year. We'll go into that later about how to look at the yield curve. Inflation, you've probably heard this in every news outlet up to this point. We're at some pretty crazy highs. The consumer price index hit 9.1%, which is the highest rate in more than 40 years. That is our traditional inflation measurement. We'll talk about that. And interest rates are on the rise. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an indicator that you're going to hear about and be aware of. The Federal Reserve raised the federal funds rate, which is, for all intents and purposes, the interest rate 75 basis points in June. And we're expecting more, potentially as much as 100 basis points in the next FOMC meeting, which would be the highest since 1994. Job growth is strong, though, which is why we get into an unusual position. The U.S. economy added 372,000 jobs in June, which was higher than expected, and we're holding unemployment steady at 3.6%. I'll tell you, in the United States history, you will not see a recession with that kind of low unemployment rate. But you can make an argument that we are in a recession. We'll talk about that later. So it is an unusual circumstance. Important to remember whenever you see on the news, hey, this is unprecedented times. Economics, modern economics, is a young subject. Really, you're only talking about post-World War II to now. So while it's a very developed subject, it's not as, you don't have these many data points that go back hundreds of thousands of years or even across many different experiments. So when somebody says unprecedented times, we are talking about situations that happen within somebody's lifetime in terms of our knowledge on the subject. And then lastly, we have some international issues that are playing games with our economy. We have the war in the Ukraine, ongoing pandemic and supply chain issues, declining Western economies, mostly in Western Europe, and then defaulting developed nations like Sri Lanka and Argentina. And then we have the very strange and unusual dollar-euro parity, which we'll go into in a bit. So let's go in to demystify some of these subjects. First, we'll talk about the gross domestic product. This is your economic output measure. Whenever somebody is trying to announce about the gross domestic product, really there we're saying, all right, so what have we done as an economy at this point in time? You can use the gross domestic product over any subset of entities. You could do the gross domestic product of Chicago if you wanted to. But traditionally, you see GDP applied to nations. In the United States, you see this in all the time as it's reported in the news. Let me explain how it's calculated so people know, and this is not hard math. I'm not asking you to do it, but it's good to know it goes into the gross domestic product. So it's everybody's consumption plus in everybody's investment, private investment, plus government spending, plus net exports, which we write in notation as NX. So that's imports differ of exports. So you can see why that's just essentially all of our economy pulled into one. It's very difficult sometimes to parse out pieces to make sure you're not double counting places where consumption and spending have interacted. But it is important to understand that's what goes into that measurement. It's a good measurement. We call it as a back of the envelope measurement, and that you can use it freely in discussions. But there's a lot of things not in that measurement. Leisure time, health, environmental aspects that are not just spending, new technologies, which actually strengthen your economy, but not necessarily immediately. Those are less tangible pieces that signal a healthy economy. They're not measured specifically in that measurement because that's just looking at the raw numbers on exports, on outputs. So just, it's important to know that that is just an output measurement, and it's not really necessarily an overall well-being health measurement. It can also be misleading. If there's a lot of government spending, that'll increase your GDP, but it doesn't necessarily mean the economy is doing better. So it's just important to understand what goes into that piece. In fact, some nations have gone away from using GDP, most famously Bhutan, which does gross national happiness, which is a very involved way to measure how everybody is feeling in the nation. Kind of easier to do on a small nation like Bhutan, but it's a very interesting measurement. So now let's go to the stock market. It's probably the item on here that you're most familiar with. Most people will have some familiarity with stocks because it is in their retirement plan, or they've talked to people about it. And it is it's a kind of a horse trading sports type thing. You can see the numbers change in real time. You can discuss why certain things are doing what they're not. Let's discuss though what is in the stock market and what is not, and how it's a measurement of the economy and how it isn't. So stocks are securities that represent an ownership share of a fraction of the issuing corporation. I'll say that's not always the case, but for most stocks you've heard of, that's the deal. It's a slight ownership percentage of the company. Companies issue stocks in order to raise funds for growth. It could be for expansion, it could be for other items, but it's meant as a fundraising tool for public companies. The units of stocks are called shares. This entitles the owner to a portion of the corporation's assets and its profits equal to how much stock they own. So key point here, if you own a little piece of Apple stock, you don't own parts of the shares at Apple's company. You'll owe a share of its profits that it records in due to your ownership share. So you're due to some of those advantages, not necessarily like the tangible assets of that company. You can, if you have large amounts of voting shares of stock, in some ways you can change kind of the direction of the company at shareholders meetings. Hopefully most people on here are not doing that, but if you are, that's great. But that is how that happens. In fact, our state treasurer and a lot of progressive Democratic state treasurer use the strength that they have in the stocks that they own as a state to try to influence possible policy into good actions, better labor rights, better environmental standards. These are called ESG investments. And you'll see that that's something that our current state treasurer works really hard at, and he leads on that subject. So an item to think about. Stocks are sold on exchanges, like the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. Not every stock listed on NASDAQ is on the New York Stock Exchange. There are other exchanges throughout the world, in Japan and in Europe. Those have different companies listed on them. Just know that doesn't represent the stock market as a whole. Those are just exchanges where you can trade certain stocks. And then the collection of all of these exchanges is known as the stock market. And usually we measure the health of those based on certain indices. S&P 500, Dow Jones. You'll see a ton of these. They're usually collecting a certain segment of types of companies, or just like the largest group or a basket of those to give an overall health. And that's important because your publicly traded companies are usually your largest companies. but they're not nearly all the companies in the United States. And it's important to understand that. In the US economy, there are roughly 32.6 million businesses. That's crazy, right? 32.6 million. 99% of those have less than 500 employees. Only about 20,868 here, that's the latest SBA standard, have 500 or more employees. And that's like, okay, so those must be the companies listed on the stock exchange. No, only about 2,500 stocks, domestic and international companies are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So even though the stock market is kind of a lagging indicator of the economy, it does not reflect all of business that is happening in the United States. And it's important to remember that. Stocks do play a huge role, though, into our retirement and college savings, because those products are based in large part on a mix of bonds and stocks and other assets. So when the stock market is hurting, it's not just the very wealthy doing poorly, and companies, it's also people's retirements and college savings. Now, I get this question a lot. We can probably go into it later. What about crypto markets? Crypto markets are, and I hazard to say, not really a security, but they're traded like such, and they're traded on different markets. Becky knows this from another situation. I would like to regulate these a little bit better, but that's a part of my day job, not this one. But crypto markets have become more popular. They're a small fraction of the overall economy, but there are people, everyday folks, going on them. They're not regulated the same way as a stock market exchange, but they have the same principle. The problem being is they're very volatile. So some of them are highly regulated. Most of those are Canadian based. We'd like to do more of that here in the United States. Some of them are not at all. And it's in some ways very difficult to choose between the good and the bad actors in that part. So just know that those are there. Some people are buying crypto to kind of guard against downturns in the stock exchange. The problem with that is it does appear at this point in time, I will say at this point in time, that those are slightly correlated. So you wouldn't be actually protecting that much in getting both of those assets. But people are talking about this. I saw a deal where Burger King was offering a deal that would get you a Bitcoin if you won. This is part of our culture now. You need to understand what these are. And we can talk about kind of differentiating them. But these are digital currency built on a digital ledger. And they are exchanged for goods and services, but they're also speculated like stocks in the stock exchange. So just be aware that those are out there and that people are investing in them. All right, this is an item that people struggle with from time to time, but is very important. So the Treasury yield curve. Treasury notes and bonds, people are usually aware of. They're securities issued by the federal government, and they have a fixed rate of interest, and they pay over a certain period of time until the security matures. And Treasury pays the par value. That is one of the safest investments you can make. It's the US Treasury, and they have different time periods of maturity, all the way from 6-month notes way out to 30-year notes. There is an interesting plot that indicator in recessions that we have noticed, economists have noticed, and that is when short-term bonds rise in value compared to long-term bonds. That's called the yield curve. And usually they're measuring the difference between the 2-year bond note and the 10-year bond note. They'll say 10-2 yield curve. When that changes or inverts, called an inverted yield curve, and it goes negative, that usually indicates a recession. Why it usually indicates a recession? Because you're basically saying the shorter term is going to pay off better than the longer term, creating doubt in the future economy. It's not perfect. We did actually dip in the yield curve just before the pandemic. And we are currently negative in the yield curve, which is a concern, but there's a lot of other noise in that number. Like I said before, we don't have a totally long history of looking at the modern economy, but just know, usually when that curve inverts, we're talking about a potential recession. Inflation. You're going to hear about inflation right up until Election Day. And it's pretty basic, although a lot of people have told me that they struggle with the concept. Basically, inflation is when prices relative to the purchasing price of the dollar rise. So my dollar now doesn't cover as much in goods as it used to. This is a notoriously difficult indicator to measure, because what really you're saying is my dollar doesn't purchase as much as what as it used to? Milk or gas or housing or clothing? Well, because there's wide ranging things you can use your dollars on, we use different ways to measure that type of change so that we can measure it historically. The most common you will see is the Consumer Price Index. That's the CPI. And this is actually a basket of goods set to 1982 basket that changes over time. And it's everything. It's from changes in food, changes in clothing, changes in transportation costs, changes in energy costs. You can get different subsections of the CPI where you're not looking at oil, or you're controlling for food, or you're getting rid of medicine costs, those things. But that's really how most news outlets will record inflation. There are pros and cons to inflation. Inflation happens as more dollars get into our system, which in some ways can be a good thing. But inflation rising unadulteratedly, uncontrollably is problematic for any economy. And that is called hyperinflation. That can cause massive issues where individuals can't cover their monthly costs that they easily could have covered a month before. If the dollar is rising at such a rate that it changes throughout the day, which is possible and has happened in many other countries, Zimbabwe famously, Germany between world wars famously, then you have a problem where you're going to have just pure economic chaos. We are not nearly at that point, but with rising inflation, that does trigger some action from our central bank, which is the Federal Reserve. They have two things that they look at: inflation and job growth or unemployment. They're meant to keep both stable. So when one is rising, they use the tools at their disposal to try to curtail that. And you'll see in a second one of them that they use for. And that is interest rates. So increasing interest rates, you're increasing borrowing costs, which discourages consumers and business spending. So if I would have used dollars to try to buy an addition on my house, or open another branch of my whatever business, you're discouraged from that because of the rising interest costs. The borrowing costs are expanding, which pulls back certain cash getting into our system. Not perfect, and it doesn't immediately cure rising inflation. You'll see that right now. How the Fed does that is actually not magically saying interest rates are going to be higher. They can't do that. What it does is it controls a rate called the federal funds rate, which is a target rate in which commercial banks can borrow and lend to each other overnight in excess of reserves. Because they control that part of the banking regulation, that rate essentially sets the floor for what banks can charge as interest. So all of our housing costs, interest, small business loans, they're built on that skeleton. If the Fed raises that rate, the banks can raise that rate as well. Now, as a bank regulator, I will tell you our economy has evolved over time. It's not just banks that are lending anymore. Back in the 70s, it was just banks. Now it is not. You have a lot of fintech companies, things that are very similar. So it's harder for the Fed to control this rate. And in a modern economy, we're learning that it is quite difficult to control inflation when it's rising kind of unexpectedly. What you have on that picture is what's called the dot point. And this is how interest rates are set is the Federal Reserve, which is a collection of appointed Fed governors, and then the presidents of each of the Fed banks, although it's a special commission. They vote on what the target interest rate should be, and then majority wins. They don't always agree on the same rate, and they'll record who dissents. Think of it kind of like how the Supreme Court dissents in a ruling. And then they say, what do you think the rate's going to be in the future? And this kind of gives this dot point, each dot is a voting member of the Fed, and you can see that they expect it to rise over time. And that's important so businesses know, okay, I can expect rising interest rates in the future. And that allows for them to start curtailing some of their business. All right, job growth. The one thing that I said, hey, this is not too bad early on. Job growth has been great. It's measured monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is a lagging indicator, though. So that is reported by each of the different bureaus to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's also something that gets asked by the Federal Reserve. And it's a sampling of job growth. So usually a couple months later, it'll get amended slightly because then you'll notice that some of that was seasonal or that was over or double counted. So even the number that's reported on the day that job report is out isn't officially the final number. But in general, jobs are being added, and our unemployment rate is low, which is good. But it is strange for the economic process that we are currently in. Like I said before, we don't get recessions with very low unemployment. It's usually some combination of high inflation plus a weird job market. That's called stagflation. If people that are around during Jimmy Carter's period know that well, that happened. And that was a very devastating number to the economy. This is low, and we expect it to be low for some time, which is kind of interesting. But know that the unemployment rate is not actually a measurement of all the people that are unemployed. So if you are under 18, you don't count in the employment rate for obvious reasons. Most people don't have full-time jobs. They're in school, things like that. Also, if you're older and retired, you don't count either, which makes sense. Now let's get into the things that maybe may not make as much sense. If you haven't been looking for a job in the past year, you also don't count. Those are discouraged workers. They're a subsection as people that are not actively trying to look for work. They are counted in other statistics with unemployment, but just know in the normal rate that is reported by the Wall Street Journal or whoever, they usually don't count. So when you see the unemployment rate stay the same at like 3.6%, but you see huge raises in unemployment, like in job creation, that's what's happening. You'll see people get into the economy that really weren't actually counted as being unemployed. And so that kind of stabilizes, but important to know that. And then we'll talk about just a couple of other items that you're gonna know, and then I'll get it to Becky. So the Russian invasion in Ukraine, war always creates some strife in the economy. Sometimes it can be beneficial for certain industries, but overall it's not great for international economies, especially with energy. We'll talk about that in a second. The ongoing pandemic is crushing supply chain issues, especially in relation to microchips and things like that. That's going to cause building materials, cars, things like that, all to be more expensive, which is hurting some of our inflation numbers as well. Also hurts home prices, by the way. And then the European energy crisis, because of the Ukraine issue, is causing a fall in some of our biggest trade partners' economies, most notably Germany. Germany, considered the engine of the European economies. It's the largest economy in Europe, but 30% of its natural gas comes from Russia, which is a huge issue for it as it goes forward. If you thought some of the inflationary numbers were bad in the United States, Germany is far worse. Also, the European Central Bank is really an indicator of two nations' economies, Germany and France, although there's obviously many nations in that. Those are the two largest economies, and so go the European Union if those collapse. And those are rising. So that's where you get down on the list, the European dollar parity. For those who've traveled abroad, you know that the euro is more expensive. You get less dollars per euro. Well, now they're even. So $1 to €1. It's very interesting when we're talking about trading between those. You might see some parity in the British pound as well, which is approaching $1, which for those who have traveled, that's quite crazy. About 50 years ago, the pound was about double the US dollar. Mm-hmm. And that will impact trade between our nations to the benefit of the United States. That being said, it's not good for the global economy as those kind of work out. Some of the British problems are still due to lingering issues with Brexit, which was the UK splitting itself from the Eurozone. And lastly, this is one that's not as covered right now, but the Chinese have invested a lot into developing nations in Southeast Asia and Africa over the last 35-ish years, mostly into infrastructure. It's called the One Belt, One Road policy. And they've been doing this for a long time. They have a lot of strategic reasons to be doing that. But you're starting to see some of those nations struggle with that lending, particularly Sri Lanka. And that might cause some defaults. Now, why should you care about the nation of Sri Lanka defaulting? We care about the people of Sri Lanka, but just know that the global economy is very interconnected. So if other nations start falling, that has impact on goods that we go sell to them, things that we trade with them, things that we trade with their trading partners, areas in general. And back to the Ukraine, economically at issue nations tend to cause economic strife that leads to conflict. And then you'll have more warring situations, which is also bad for the global economy. So with that, I'll wrap up. And that is my general presentation on that. So I'll unshare my screen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Chase. I always feel like I learn something more when I hear you speak, which I've heard you speak a couple of times before. So thank you again. And I don't think, we expect everyone on this call to be able to go out and spread the gospel of all things, economic and whatnot. But it is important to have a basic understanding of this because of all the fake news that is out there. And when you're encountering voters, it's good to come from an informed place so that you can push back on some of that, because the economy and inflation and the budget and our state's finances, they do come into play right now with voters. So when you're going to be out and about in the coming, weeks and months, doing what you do to help get out the Democratic vote, it's important to have a good foundational understanding of these things. And what I was going to do is talk a little bit about what's going on here in Illinois, because we have a lot of good news to spread around, and Democrats get to take credit for that. And I only am here because I do know a little bit about this space. I spent 5 years as the communications director for the governor's office of management and budget, which included a year as the deputy chief of staff for the budget. So for better or worse, it was my job to help the masses understand how all of this works. And we were very involved at that time when I was there on helping people to understand just how horrible our budget or our pension situation was. And there is a little good news on that front. So, in talking about what's happening here locally in Illinois, it's very helpful for Democrats like yourself when you're out there engaging voters to be able to talk about the remarkably improved financial position that Illinois is in. Now, we're not out of the woods, but we have not seen this kind of movement literally in like a couple of decades. And it's all happened under the leadership of Governor Pritzker, Democratic leadership in the House and Senate, other folks like, even Comptroller Mendoza, Treasurer Frericks, and really Democratic activists like you, because you fought to help get these Democratic margins. And now that we're in office, it's making a really huge difference. So even though, you're out spread across 102 counties of Illinois, take credit for this when you're talking to voters. So under his watch, under the last 4 years, almost 4 years, there's been 6 credit rating upgrades from the 3 credit rating agencies. And that has a big impact on our finances, because the better our credit ratings, the better interest rates we're going to get when we have to borrow. When they're higher, it takes a lot more money out of our pocket. When it's lower, less money out of our pocket. Now, they cited things such as improvement of the state's financial flexibility, for timely budget adoptions passed and signed by the House and Senate and the governor, a significant reduction in our bill backlog at the state. We're talking $17 billion bill backlog left over by the former administration under Warner. So, and we haven't had this kind of not a single credit rating upgrade in 20 years. And that's really remarkable. So these are things that you can go out there and talk about.
And real carefully, the last time, how rare this is for us, the last time we had a credit upgrade was because they changed how the ratings work. We got it by default. So like, so it really has been since the 97, 96 area that it hasn't. I know, because I was talking to Alexis Strum, who's the budget director here, and she just started her career right around when we had our last one. So it is really quite amazing what this administration has done.
Yeah, and you're right. And it really can't be understated, everyone, because this is polling very significantly among general election voters, both Democrats and Republicans, but even more so when you're outside the Cook County, Northern Illinois area. The budget and finances of the state really does matter to people, and more so in some ways than it does, say, some of the more social issues. Although for Democrats, issues like abortion is still very critical and is polling the highest right now. But do understand, it is good to go out there and talk about the fact that we've got a credit rating upgrade for the first time, 6, and for the first time in 20 years. And the rating agencies have cited significant improvements in our state's finances. And that's again happened under a Democratic governor and under a Democratic House and Senate. So you guys can all take credit out there when you're knocking and going door to door. And additionally, the being able to talk about this helps to fill this like void sometimes. This fake, there's so much fake news out there and spin about what the reality is, not just nationally under Biden, but here locally in Illinois under the Democrats and under Pritzker. So it's really important that you're out there helping to fill a void of a lack of understanding or knowledge about what's going on with our state's finances, because you'll be able to balance out this negative narrative and fake news that you're going to hear a lot about from the Republicans. Dan Proft's going to be funded by the U-Lines, and they're going to be out there wherever they can to try to, nick away, whether it's a state race, whether it's a local county race, whatever it might be. So take credit for the good news that's happening right now at the state with its finances, because that's going to help you regardless, I think, of whatever office that you're running for, you're helping other people run for, and you're helping to support. So Chase spoke a little bit about this when I was going through this, but you spent many years in the state treasurer and comptroller's office. So speak a little bit more too about why it's so significant to have rating agency upgrades, and as well to have the kind of things that they've cited as to why they've given the state 6 credit rating upgrades.
So it's a great point. When we borrow money, and every government borrows money, and the reason for that is you want to pay for projects over time. If I'm going to build a school, multiple generations are going to benefit from that. So the financing is kind of spread over a period of time, and that's one of the reasons we do borrowing. But every time we borrow money to function, we get charged that interest rate depending on what our credit rating agency or rating is. And if we have a lower rating, we can't use that money on other things. And it locks our ability to borrow for other projects, in some cases, even pay for certain services that we do, although usually borrowing that's separate. But it is very important to be benefiting from that increase. And then going back to my life at the comptroller's office, and Susana Mendoza has done a really good job, I think, since she was there. And obviously Governor Pritzker, they've been a good team on this particular subject. When we were first there, first came in, and that was a special election, and a lot of people on this call helped her get there. We actually were paying some of in the neighborhood of 12% interest on backload bills. It's a penalty within the state legislature in the statute that discourages us from being delayed in our payments. Well, apparently not as discouraging enough, because under the Rauner administration, that these penalties started to increase because we were not able to pay those services without a budget appropriation. And that was scary, because that money is just gone. Well, you might as well have burned it. It had nothing to do ultimately with any program that we wanted to put forth, or it doesn't go to schools or anything else. Other than that, it was being paid for the backlog bills. Now, you could say it's to benefit those who, who were not going to get that money in the meantime, and it certainly was, but it was really, really hurting our ability to process. And then, as you've seen from the governor and kind of some of the different programs that he's worked on, as well as stuff the comptroller has prioritized, that number had gone from an unthinkable number in the tens of billions, I think 13 billion was before I left, all the way down to where it is today. And really, they're within that 60-day window that hits for that interest rate. That's a massive. Right. That's money for you. This is the people's money. This isn't for the state to do new things and pay themselves and all that stuff. This is for schools. This is for special programs. This allows us to do all the different things that we as Democrats want to make sure that we can put forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because this is something that I think it's really important also for people to understand. When you're paying extraordinarily high interest rates on bills that are 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 months old, that's money that's not going to education, right? That's not money that's going to healthcare, right? That's not money that's going down to, invest in pensions and whatnot. It's not, or it's money that's coming out of our pockets in other ways. So to be able to bring down that backlog, which in 4 years was 17 billion, it's pretty significant, right? I mean, what do you think we're talking about ballpark that's getting saved here ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, you start getting, you start seeing some of the major items that don't have clear appropriation standards. Remember, the things that get paid for first are items that are obligated by the sovereign debt of the state. So that's debt holders. Those are the people that bought our bonds. Now, they should be paid. If you don't pay them, we aren't able to borrow at all. But that isn't your schools or after school programs. the items that social safety net that helps the most vulnerable, that weakens when we have to pay interest to those that have the backlog. So that's an important piece to it. And then also, and I know we're going to probably go here too, you can pay down our retirement with our pension stuff. You can put more money toward that if you have it available to you. What really the governor and the legislature took a step on was trying to make sure that some of that money that was being saved by pushing that down was going toward those pension payments, something that, you know, his Republican predecessor really couldn't say. That's another important piece.
Right. And pensions is always a very hot button issue. So that's why, again, I think it's important for everyone to be able to work into those talking points that we invested, you know, hundreds of millions more into pensions to bring them down. We reduced and eliminated a $17 billion bill backlog, and that's allowing us to be able to invest in other really critical services and programs and pensions, and also just not spend money where we don't have to. So, hey, Jillian, I don't know if there's some questions that we want to be able to take that might be in the chat, but I thought this would be a good time to roll those in since we're on about 11 minutes out.
Sure. We had a question from Julia. The pension crisis was, you know, a big news item for a long time. And Julia wanted to know, is the TRS pension picture that much better now? And how to talk about that.
So, and you're just talking about one of the pension pools, and we have 3 others. Well, you have
3 others.
So you have the this is kind of irrelevant, but like
There's some.
you have the TRS, and then you have SCS, and then the State Investment Board pulls the other 3 underneath it, and then that doesn't even count Chicago's pension situation, those sort of things. We still have a very large unfunded pension liability.
Yeah.
And that will continue to be a problem that we have to address, which is, I know, a major issue of the governor. Like I said before, by getting our short-term financial debt in order, that allows us to pay down some of that unfunded liability. So that is one of the items that you can talk about, and that would impartially go to things like payments to TRS and as SERS and those folks. But it is going to continue to be an item that'll be a trigger point. Now, this always frustrates me a little bit because it seems like the Republicans like to bring up this pension liability issue for the state of Illinois. Just want to point out that the time period in whence that some of this liability came from was from the pension ramp in the mid-90s, when there was a Republican governor, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. Neither here nor there. Obviously, there have been multiple.
Facts.
But it is what happened. I just want to point that out. But it's also true that there have been multiple Democratic administrations since then, and they have all kind of struggled on this issue. This is a long-term issue. What I would say is the current administration is working, and they have shown that they are willing to put money towards fixing this problem, but it will not be solved in 1 year. The Republicans cannot solve it in 1 year, and the Democrats cannot solve it in 1 year. But you have an administration that has shown to federal regulators, to national credit rating agencies, and just in general with their national budgets to independent groups that in a lot of ways end up hitting Democrats a lot, that they can be trusted with your money, that they will bring down these debts and these bill backlogs to try to address this problem. So I would say that you're getting a vote of confidence from a lot of independent sources that are fairly conservative in their thinking, that this is an administration with a Senate and a comptroller and a treasurer that is focused on fixing this problem, where they weren't in previous Republican and Democratic administrations. And they have put money toward this problem. And while that won't be fixed tomorrow, they're working on it long term, so it isn't put solely on the burden of individuals, taxpayers here in the state.
And that's another really important point to emphasize. The credit rating agencies, they just don't give away credit upgrades. It takes a lot of work and convincing to get them to give an upgrade. So if you're ever debating someone or someone doesn't really understand, you say, there's no more independent entities than the credit rating agencies who don't give away credit rating upgrades unless there's a really darn good set of reasons to do so. They're not partisan. They're, hardcore, actuaries, I think, right, Chase? So
Yeah,
these are people who have very serious jobs and they have to make very serious decisions.
Yes, and you will see it is difficult. I talk to these folks often, and I have in my career, and it is very difficult for them to kind of get on your good side with those. I did want to show one tool that I think is very helpful that you can get on the comptroller's website. And if you really just want to show the raw numbers to this, let me just share this real quick. You can see on the comptroller's website, and this is public information, and I remember this because we were part of the design of this. This is our bill backlog, and you can see the change when that first spike up to 16 billion. That was when the Democrats worked with some breakaway Republicans to overturn Rauner's veto. And it ended up being pushed down, and then we had to pay off that piece, and that's where you've seen this decline since then. So if somebody doesn't believe you that, hey, no, Illinois is always bad, just know that this exists here. These are the real numbers that show that that we have been paying down this problem.
Great. We have another question in the chat here about the impact of the recreational marijuana tax revenue that's been generated. Do you have a sense, Chase, of how that's, impacted our revenues, our finances? Any insight on that?
Yeah, it's higher than it was expected. Now, without getting into a really nerdy conversation about this, that fund is actually paid out through what's called a waterfall. So it touches a lot of different places. And that's through the bill that was passed. So there's money there that goes to local governments. There's money there that goes to the standard revenue pieces. There's money that goes to regulation, not me, but another part of IDFPR. But I know that it was higher than it was expected. I don't have the exact number on me, but that definitely has led to some flexibility in our finances. But it's not as flexible as like some of the tax revenue and some of those items, because that's just a larger haul. But it certainly was a benefit. And it certainly goes toward, also remember, when you make legal something that was previously illegal, you save on costs for enforcing the legality of the illegal piece. So you do decrease some of those policing costs in theory long term. They're not immediate, but longer term as well.
And then, of course, no one's going to jail anymore. That's another expense. So yeah, you're right. There's that
person doesn't leave the economy.
Right. Exactly. So I'm not sure, Jillian, if we missed any other questions in the chat, but I know we're getting right up on 7 o'clock. And if there are any other last questions anyone would like to ask, of course, we're happy to answer it.
We unfortunately are coming up on our hour mark here. So I don't know if you, Becky and Chase, had any parting things to say. Give people a chance if they have any last minute questions to ask to put in that chat.
Yeah, all I'd like to say is, don't be afraid to go out there and tout all of these great accomplishments that have happened over the last nearly 4 years under all this Democratic leadership. This matters, and it's a great opportunity to help counter fake negative narratives that are out there by those who are trying to paint a picture that just doesn't really exist. So I would say, if you're trying to find some of these stats, if you didn't take notes, I would say follow both Comptroller Mendoza and Governor Pritzker on Twitter. They do lots of tweeting about this in really easy, digestible bites. And it's just an easy way to also share it, but then take that and use it yourself in your conversations with voters.
Yeah, and I would just say, don't feel mystified when economic reports come out or people talk about, this number or that number. There's usually someone, sometimes I'll do it on my Twitter, but there's usually somebody like at Planet Money or one of those items that'll explain that concept in a basic way. So people can sometimes say like, oh, inflation's out of control. Well, is it really? And what does that mean? And if it is, what are we going to do about it? And those things are out there, and hopefully you've learned a little bit to demystify some of that subject material.
And it does look like we did have one final question come in. If you guys are willing to answer, we got a question from Kathy here about what the role of gambling is in Illinois' financial situation currently.
Oh, like
Sports betting.
online gambling or casino, or both. Sports gaming, it's been legal here in Illinois. Similar to cannabis, has a waterfall structure to its fee, and it does help our economy long term, especially the online part. Casinos, I'm not as much of an expert on that kind of economic development. I know that's a mixed bag in certain areas of the country. I haven't studied it here in Illinois, but I'm sure that a Chicago area casino will bring in a significant amount of money ultimately to the municipality. But online gaming, certainly, especially with sports betting, live sports betting, those sort of items, definitely bring in a ton of revenue to the state.
All right, well, that looks like all of our questions for now. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us here tonight. Thank you to Becky and Chase. This was a super informative presentation, and we are very thankful to have you walk us through some very complex topics here tonight. So without further ado, I will let everybody else go. Enjoy your evening, and we hope to see you at the next virtual training. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.